It was absolutely at this time of year, and in fact, it may have been today, that Jesus and his disciples were walking through a field of grain, and disciples, as they went, just reached down, grabbed a little handful of it, and began to rub it between their hands to get rid of the husks and so forth on it, and then popped it in their mouth and chewed as they went on down the road. To us, that seems like a relatively insignificant thing to do. To the Pharisees, it was not. To the Pharisees, it was threshing. In a way, it was reaping. It was also threshing, and you weren't supposed to do that on the Sabbath day. It's not entirely unthinkable that people would come to conclusions like that, because in a civil society, when you're trying to walk together, legislators are really in the business of drawing lines. Lines that can be enforced, lines that can give the community some regulation, as it were. And so we don't have to decide, well, if you can gather one handful, how about two? And if two, why not three? And if three, why not four? And if four, why not a bushel? And if a bushel, why not let's just go out there and harvest the whole field? This is the kind of rationale that oftentimes causes people to start drawing lines, very legalistic lines, about what a person can or cannot do. Can I wash a cup on the Sabbath day after I've had a cup of coffee? If one cup, why not two? If two, why not three? And so the old question begins onward. But in Luke chapter 6, we come to this particular problem. It reads, "It came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands." That's the King James Version. You may notice NIV and most other translations do not have the first and second comments in there. The reason for this is that really what are considered by scholars to be the best manuscripts don't have that. I think Codex Sinaiticus does, Codex Vaticanus and Alexandrinus do not. These are all really pretty contemporary as far as their age is concerned. And scholars work their way back through these things to try to find reasons why they think something would be in or something would be not out. In this case, it really doesn't make an awful lot of difference. Only the fact that it would bring us to this particular day. We know that it was at this time of year, and we know it was certainly the Sabbath. And so I thought this would make a good time for us to stop and develop the theme of the incident growing out of this particular this incident. The thing, as I said, seems harmless enough to us. That's what many of us would do, walking through a grain field on the Sabbath day, a little bit hungry, and it's certainly within the law to take something and eat it as you walk through. So we would probably freely do such a thing. But the Pharisees said to them, "Why do you do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days?" Luke 6, verse 2. Now, when they said not lawful, they were talking about Jewish law. As I said, rubbing the grain between the hands was threshing. Threshing was prohibited not by the law of Moses, but by the law of the Jews. Now Jesus then said, "Haven't you read so much as this, what David did, when he was himself hungered, and they which were with him, how he went into the house of God, and did take and eat the showbread, which also he gave to them that were with him, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priests alone." Now, I think this is a fascinating example that he draws here, and I don't want us to overlook what he says. He acknowledged that what David did was not lawful, didn't he? There's no question about it. David did not do away with the law. Christ did not dismiss the law. He says categorically what David did was not lawful. And yet, in the way in which he uses the illustration, he implies that what David did incurred no penalty, incurred no sanction, that in a sense it was not imputed to David. Now, I choose the phrase not imputed because of something Paul said. You may want to keep your place in Luke. I want to make a citation from the book of Romans chapter 4. It's a short section, but it's also a fascinating one. It's puzzling to many people. They don't really understand what Paul is driving at, but I think it connects. He says, "To him that works not," Romans 4, verse 5, "to him that works not, but believes on him that justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness." Now, any fool will know that this is not talking about the willful ungodly. It isn't talking about your being willing to live an ungodly life and expecting it to be imputed to you just because you believe in Jesus. Even as David also describes the blessedness of the man to whom God imputes righteousness apart from works, saying, "Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin." Now, what do you have to do to be the kind of a person to whom the Lord will not impute sin? Actually, the word impute is kind of interesting. The Greek word is one you would use if you were in business and you say, "We're going to take an inventory." It is to take an inventory. Blessed is the man for whom God does not inventory his sins. Actually, this is another way of saying that the grace of God winks at things that men do under unusual circumstance, that God overlooks them. He does not hold them accountable. He does not impute a sin or inventory a sin against a man under certain kinds of circumstances when he does something that is, technically speaking, unlawful. It's the only way I can take this because, after all, Jesus made it clear that what David did was unlawful, and it seems clear enough in the context that he wasn't going to hold him accountable for it. I can only say, though, woe to the man who presumes upon God's grace and thinks, "Oh, well, God won't mind this," or "I don't think God will care about this," or "I don't think," whatever you think, or maybe even to think that something God says is wrong is not actually wrong. That's not the way you approach this type of thing. Well, the way you approach it is that I know it is wrong, but the circumstances, I think, are such that God will overlook what I am doing in this situation. He said to them then, Jesus went on to say in verse 5 of Luke 6, "The Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." Now, this, of course, leaves us wondering why on earth anyone would assume that any day other than the Sabbath is the Lord's day, but, who's counting? In Mark's version of this incident, he adds an interesting little statement. He says, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." I think that's a fascinating statement, too, because it underlines what the Sabbath really is for. Now, we all know from the reading many repetitions of the book chapters out of Exodus that the Sabbath is actually a sign between God and his people as to who he is. The circumcision was a sign of the Jews, but the Sabbath was a sign of Yahweh or Jehovah. It was a sign of who God was. And in resting on the Sabbath day, they acknowledged and recognized who their God was. He was Jehovah and not somebody else of the myriad gods of the countries that existed all over the place round about them. But at the same time, he says the Son of Man, and that's clearly speaking of himself, is Lord of the Sabbath. In Mark's version, he adds this. I'm sorry, I've just mentioned that. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Then Matthew adds this. "Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" Now, my thought would have normally been to say that the priests, in the work that they did in the temple on the Sabbath day, were not breaking the Sabbath. Because after all, it was the commandment of God that every day, including Sabbath days, they had to do certain things. And yet Jesus says that the priests profane the Sabbath. They actually violate the Sabbath in the temple and are blameless. Well, so what he's saying is that work, any work, even the work in the temple, is to profane the Sabbath. So why, then, were the priests blameless in spite of that? Well, when two laws come into conflict, shouldn't the greater law prevail over the lesser law? As you may think the Word of God, laws of God can never come into conflict, but you'd be mistaken. In life, they can. And you would naturally assume that the greater law would prevail, wouldn't you? Well, then what happens here? You ask yourself, which is greater, the Sabbath day or the sacrificial law? Most of us would say the Sabbath day. And yet what Jesus is saying here is that the work of the priests in the temple trumps the Sabbath law, actually overrides it. And that seems, on the surface of it, to be strange. Now, why would this be so? Why would that be possible, or why would it be worked out this way? The answer is not too hard to find. The temple was the stage upon which the plan of God was played out throughout the annual cycle of festivals, Sabbaths, sacrifices, and so forth that were done. The plan of God is also known as the gospel. That in a very real manner of speaking, in Old Testament times, what the priests did on the stage in the temple was to play out the gospel before the people of God. So in a sense, what they were doing in their generation, they were preaching the gospel in the temple every bit as much as Paul would be preaching the gospel in a synagogue when he went in there to preach. Now, Jesus went on to say about this profaning of the Sabbath. He said, and this is Matthew 12, verse 5, "Have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath day in the temple the priests profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. If you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." Now, I have to pause here and tell you, we got to be real careful not to assume that anything that Jesus does here in any way minimizes the Sabbath day, that it does not in any way diminish the Sabbath. It does not in any way diminish our obligations to keep the Sabbath day according to the intent and the spirit of God's law. Not at all. In fact, you're going to find on the contrary, he affirms the Sabbath in its true intent. Because the Sabbath day is, in every sense, a matter of the heart. There's another familiar scripture. It's Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13. Isaiah 58, verse 13. And I think this is really important. Think carefully about what I'm going to read to you here. "If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day." Now, what does that mean? Other translations kind of take it from doing as you please, or from pleasing yourself, or from just doing the things you like. I don't think it can mean that you would not enjoy pleasure, because a sunset is a pleasure, a piece of beautiful music is a pleasure, being with friends is a pleasure, being with family is a pleasure. That's not what he means here. He said, "From doing your pleasure on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, and honorable, and here's the operative phrase, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, not finding your own pleasure, not speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it." Now, is something beginning to shape up in your mind a little bit here as we talked about the things we've dealt with so far? Especially in that little phrase, "you shall honor him." It is in the keeping of the Sabbath day that we honor God and that we acknowledge him as our God. We come together for communal worship, to worship and to honor him. We honor him in song. We honor him in deed. We honor him by taking the day off work and saying, "No, sir, this is the Lord's Sabbath day. I don't work today." We honor him in so many ways, and that's what it really is all about. And when you make an exception to the Sabbath, as in removing an ox from the ditch, which Jesus makes it very clear, you can do that. Never forget that it is an exception to the Sabbath. It is not a diminishing thereof. Never forget that what you have done is to break the Sabbath, but that God is going to overlook it because you were taking care of this poor suffering animal. Never forget that just like the priests profane the Sabbath in the temple, you and I may profane the Sabbath in the process of doing good, in rescuing someone, carrying somebody's body out, almost burning body out of a fire, and any number of things that I could mention. That sure, we profane the Sabbath. We also do like David eating the showbread. We do what is unlawful, but we depend on the mercy and the grace of God to overlook it. And we never forget, this is an exception. This is not what the Sabbath is about. I'm doing this in an emergency. I'm doing this because it's needful for this person or that person. And in actual fact, I am, by my act, honoring God. For the priest in the temple was honoring God in what he did on the Sabbath day. Jesus, in healing on the Sabbath day, was honoring God at every turn when he healed someone on the Sabbath day. Our exceptions that we do should always be kept in mind that we are honoring God. Now, returning to where we left off in Luke 6, verse 6. It came to pass on another Sabbath. He entered into the synagogue and taught, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. And I guess in a way, this one captures my imagination as much as any miracle Jesus ever did. I would have loved to have been able to see this. Poor man with a withered hand. I've seen people with that kind of a clutched up, withered arm. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they might find an accusation against him. Every time I read this, I just shake my head and say, now, wait a minute. Why in the world would you want to find an accusation against a person who was able to heal a sick man, who is able to cure someone of cancer, who is able to give sight to the blind, to make a lame man walk, to take a man who's got this poor withered up hand here and make it whole like the other? Why would you want to find something to make an accusation against a man who could do that? But you see, the problem was not so much that Jesus did these things on the Sabbath day. The problem was that he did them at all. This was what posed the problem for the Jews. He knew their thoughts. And he said to the man that had the withered hand, rise up, stand up in the middle. He rose and stood forth. And he said, I'm going to ask every one of you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? And looking around upon all of them, he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored whole like the other. Now, a synagogue is not a really very large building. If you've ever been in one of those old synagogues down in Palestine, they are really quite small. Everyone in the building would have been able to see this and see it quite distinctly when Jesus told this poor man, whom they knew, they'd seen him week after week with his withered arm, told him, stretch forth your hand. And to watch him put his hand out and see that arm become whole just like the other arm. Everyone in the place could see that. And you would think a great awe would rise up from the people, oohing and awing over what this man what has happened here. Isn't this wonderful? Praise God. Thank God. Look what God has done. But no, they were filled with madness, and they communed with one another what they might do to Jesus. What are you going to do? And what are you going to say to people who do that? Now, I said, I don't think it's so much that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day that bothered them. They were looking for an excuse to discredit Jesus for one simple reason: jealousy. He was a threat to their power. He was a threat to the respect and awe in which they were held by all the people in their congregation. He was surpassing all their leaders, all their spiritual leaders, all their religious leaders on every side. And all of them felt diminished by Jesus, what he said, what he did, perhaps even by his gentleness and his goodness. They all felt small. And for human beings, some human beings, that is almost intolerable. One of the great things in life is to learn how to feel small, how to recognize how small you are, how easy it is to forget how small we are, so that when we are made to feel small, we are angry, we are hurt, we become resentful. That's what was going on here. Now, why on earth the healing of a man would be breaking the Sabbath is beyond my feeble reasoning powers. I can't get from here to there. But after all, it was work, just as rubbing grain between your hands was threshing. Healing the sick is a kind of work. But what Jesus is saying here is that healing the sick is of a piece with the work of the priests in the temple. Think about it. It is of a piece with it, because what the priests in the temple were doing was playing out the gospel before the people. What Jesus was doing was living out the gospel before the people. He was healing the sick. He was forgiving sins, which was, in some measure, part of the work of the priests. The fact is, it is the work of God, and the work of God may be done on the Sabbath because it honors him. You understand that simple principle? You can do the work of God on the Sabbath day because in doing his work, you honor him. That's what Jesus was saying. Someone once wrote in and asked, why we had our radio program on radio stations on the Sabbath. because the station shouldn't be open, shouldn't even be on the air on the Sabbath. My reply is, well, they're going to be on the air on the Sabbath whether we're there or not. And it may well be that the half hour our program is on is the only hour of the day when they are not breaking the Sabbath. So why should we take it off? Anyway, I don't know if it made any difference to the person I wrote to or not, but I said that anyway. Matthew says something of this instance. You'll find this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 11. He said to them, what man is there going to be among you that has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day? Will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? Now, you got to look around at congregation. Here's a small synagogue again. He's looking around at him and says, now, which one of you, if you had a sheep in a pit, fall in a pit on the Sabbath day, you wouldn't get over there and grab that sheep by his wool and lift him out of the pit and put him on his feet? You know you would. So I can only assume from this that all the people in the synagogue there knew that that was something they would do. And then Jesus said, how much better is a man than a sheep? If you do that, why can't I heal this man with his withered arm? Isn't a man better than a sheep? So it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. Now, I know some people have taken that to mean, well, if what I'm doing is a good thing, then I can do it on the Sabbath day. No, that's not what Jesus is talking about. What Jesus is talking about are those things that honor God, those things that are God's work, not your work, but his work. These are the things, the gifts that you give to other people in that way in God's name are these things. Now, I think this is a revealing comment because it addresses the Jewish customs of the time. They would do this. They would actually do the work of saving an animal. Now, Mark adds another footnote to this one. Mark chapter 3, verse 4. He says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, to do evil, to save life, to kill, and so forth? They held their peace. And when he had looked around upon them with anger, being grieved at the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. And you know, that makes so much sense. How on earth could you be in that circumstance, as Jesus was, know what you're about to do, know what their response is going to be, know the attitudes that are there, and not be angry, just royally angry, at the kind of hardness of heart, the brittleness of these people? And I want you to think about something, though. This is characteristic of the legalistic mind, a mind with a lack of compassion, a kind of brittleness, an unbending, rigid interpretation of the law. I once heard a minister say in a sermon, God will not compromise 1 inch with his law. Now, that statement would be perfectly logical coming from the mouth of any Pharisee, because they were so concerned about God missing an inch that they built a fence around the law. They would start the Sabbath a half hour early, end the Sabbath a half hour late. They had a whole set of rules to not only prevent them from breaking the law, but to prevent them from getting close to breaking the law. Admirable, perhaps, except the way in which it goes about and the attitude of mind that it fosters. God will not compromise 1 inch with his law. It sounds good, but it is completely wrong, abjectly wrong. God compromised with the law when he allowed Jesus to suffer and die in our place, because the law demanded our death, not somebody else's. God compromised with the law in not punishing David for the showbread incident. He compromised with the law in not blaming the priests for their work in the temple on the Sabbath day. Every act of mercy is a compromise with the unbending nature of the law. Do you understand what Paul is saying when he says the law kills? The law doesn't make provision for mercy. The law just simply says, you do this, you die. You do this, you die. You do that, you die. You do that, you have to do this. Has the whole rigmarole all laid out for you. The law doesn't make allowance for that. Law is a terrible taskmaster. We live in our country under what we call the rule of law. And some of us have never even begun to tumble to the fact that the law can become a greater tyrant than King George ever was, if the law is all you got. Mercy triumphs over law, and every act of mercy, every act of grace, the very existence of grace, is a compromise with the law. But that doesn't give you and me the right to compromise with the law. You understand? God can, because he is God. But you and I can't, because we're not. Our job is to look at the law and to consider it as a guide to life. And whenever we interpret the law and try to apply the law, we're not compromising it. We're doing our best to try to be obedient to it. If we break the law, we have to depend on the grace of God to see us through. And as I've said before, I'll say it again, woe to the man who presumes upon God's grace. The Sabbath, as I said earlier, is a matter of the heart. In Luke chapter 13, verse 10, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman that had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift up herself. I haven't seen many cases of this in my lifetime, maybe one or two or three, of people who were really badly bent over, other than just, people being a little bit stooped from old age. This woman was really bent over. When Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God, and I would certainly think so. I mean, to 18 years be like that, and then have a man lay his hands on you and suddenly be able to stand up straight for the first time in 18 years, yeah, I'd glorify God. I wouldn't stop glorifying God, I don't think, for the next months. Anyway, she did. This healing, by the way, honored God, because what happens? The woman glorified God for the healing. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day. And he said to the people out there, he said, "Look, there are 6 days when men ought to work. Let them come then and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Where did he get that? Your guess is as good as mine. The Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrite." Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, looks a guy in the eye and calls him a hypocrite. "You hypocrite, doesn't every one of you here untie and loose his ox or his ass on the Sabbath day, lead the animal to the water and get him a drink and take him back and tie him back up again?" You do that, don't you? You would do that, wouldn't you? If you had to keep your animal tied up, you didn't have fences and all this kind of stuff. Sabbath day came, you had to tie the thing up, or had it someplace. You would actually have to untie it, take it to the water. Okay? He says you would do that. Then shouldn't this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? You'd untie an ass, and you're going to stand there and complain about me untying this woman that Satan has tied up and bound? No wonder he called him a hypocrite. It's total hypocrisy. And of course, it's based upon jealousy. The fact that Jesus was gaining the respect of the people, and they felt that they were somehow losing their position or their authority with the people. Side note to that is the fact that Satan had bound this woman. Why on earth would he do that? It's hard to say. No one should try to predict that evil mind. But he hates life. He is the enemy of life. He is the enemy of truth. And he just basically enjoys, I think, human suffering. It's the only conclusion I can come to. And of course, when you actually see what some of the evil men in this world have done when they had power in torturing people, you have to come to the conclusion that they really do get pleasure from causing people pain. Where do they get that? They get it from their father, the devil. Well, when Jesus said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for the glorious things that were done by him. I would hope so, wouldn't you, that everyone would be ashamed? John chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, and withered. And a certain man was there who had an infirmity for 38 years. No, it doesn't tell us how old he was, but he'd been this way for 38 years. A lot older than a lot of you in this room are. When Jesus saw him lie and knew he'd been a long time in that case, he said to him, "Will you be made whole?" And the impotent man said, "Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me in the pool. But while I'm coming, another person gets there before I can get there." Now, you'd naturally ask yourself, what in the world does he mean by when the water is troubled? Well, some ancient manuscripts have, in verse 3 and 4, that he was there waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whoever then first got in after the troubling of the water stepped in, was made whole of whatever disease he had. Now, that is said not in most of the best manuscripts. I don't even know for sure which manuscripts it shows up in. I think it apparently is there. There was a tradition to the effect that this is the reason, this is the rationale behind the man's statement about he was waiting for the troubling of the water. Anyway, it's not terribly relevant because Jesus said, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." Immediately the man was made whole. He took up his bed and walked, and on the same day was the Sabbath. Again, to you and I, the healing is the remarkable thing. But it wasn't the remarkable thing to some other people. And bear in mind, by the way, this could not have been anything more than a bedroll. And you consider what the Jews said. They said to him that was cured, "It's the Sabbath day. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed." And the man said, "Well, he that made me whole, the same said unto me, take up your bed and walk." He says, "Look, this guy made me whole. I've been 38 years lying down there. I'm not lying there anymore. I'm able to get up." And the man that did that said, "Take up your bedroll and walk." Now, in his mind, the fact that Jesus could heal him trumped the Pharisees' rules about how much you could actually carry in your hand on the Sabbath day, which was what? Weight of a fig or something like that you were allowed to pick up and carry. Bedroll is a little more than that, but there's not a person in here who would really consider that to be work. And you sure wouldn't consider it work if you'd just been healed of an infirmity of having to lie on that thing for some 38 years. He said, "Hey, the guy that made me whole said, pick it up and carry it. I'm carrying it." So they said, "Well, what man told you this? Take up your bed and walk." And he that was healed didn't even know who it was. I think this is fascinating. His faith had nothing to do with it, other than maybe his faith that there was an angel that troubled the water, and he believed that God would heal the first person there, whatever the faith that was. But he did not even know who Jesus was. And Jesus healed him. They said, I don't know. But Jesus had gotten away. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said, "Now look, you're made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." Now, it'd be hard to argue in the face of this that there's no connection between sin and disease. Some people want to make that argument. I don't. I see the connection quite clearly. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him whole. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done those things on the Sabbath day. And Jesus said, "My Father works hitherto, and I work." What does it say? It says to me that the work of God can be done on the Sabbath day. My work, your work, cannot. I can work like a beaver all day long on the Sabbath day, preparing a sermon, coming here and delivering it. It is work. Don't think it's not. But I can't go out and cut my grass. That's my work. That's my, doing my maintenance work around the house, that's my work. But I can do God's work today. I can visit the sick. I can go encourage the faint-hearted. I can spend a little time with the lonely. I can come to church. I can worship. I can give a sermon. I can do my Bible study. I can do research on the internet about some Bible topic because that's God's work. But when it comes time to start driving nails around the house, that'll have to wait till tomorrow. When it comes time to balance my bank statement, that'll have to wait till tomorrow. My income tax return was done a Sunday sometime back. But again, it waited until after the Sabbath. Those are all our work. Well, the Jews sought the more to kill him because he not only had broken the Sabbath, and you can put that in quotes because that was their idea, not God's, but he also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. And the only Sabbath law he broke was their rule about how much you could carry on the Sabbath. The law does say, don't carry any burden out of your house on the Sabbath. Well, how much burden is a rolled up blanket, are we allowed to interpret that far? I think you and I are, and Jesus would say we are. The Pharisees would say, no, you're not. This is what our rule is. Jesus answered, my doctrine is not mine. It's him that sent me. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. He that speaks of himself seeks his own glory. He that seeks his glory that sent him, the same is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Didn't Moses, by the way, give you the law? And yet none of you keep the law. Why are you going about to kill me? That must have been stunning. Because they didn't think he knew. They knew what they were doing. But they didn't know that Jesus knew. And here he says, you don't keep the law of Moses. You're going around to kill me. The people answered and said, you have a demon. Who's going around to kill you? Nobody's going around to kill you. Actually, they didn't deny. They said, who's going around to kill you? And Jesus answered and said, I've done one work, and you all marvel. Moses gave you circumcision, not because it's of Moses, it's of the fathers. And you on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. Now, if a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, so the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? His reasoning is faultless. And of course, it identifies them as the hypocrites that they are. John chapter 9. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from his birth. His disciples asked him, saying, Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Because you see, the disciples did make the connection between sin and disease. Jesus answered, neither this man has sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. What work? God's work. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he had spoken this way, he spat on the ground, made clay of the spittle, anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and came seeing. This was a man born blind. Now, I'm sure it has occurred to you at some point in time, if you studied this before, to realize that all Jesus had to do was to say, be healed. And the man could have seen. He had to do nothing more than say the word. So why did he spit on the ground, make clay out of the spittle, and put the clay across the man's eyes and send him off to wash? It was a deliberate provocation of the Pharisees. Deliberate, just like the man taking up his bed and walk. He could have just told him, get up and walk. He didn't have to take up his bed. That was a deliberate provocation. The making of the clay, you're not supposed to do that kind of work on the Sabbath day, even no matter how small it is. He did it anyway. But again, it was God's work. I think he just was deliberately challenging these men. Go wash. He came seeing. And his neighbors, therefore, and they which had seen him that was blind, said, hey, this is the guy that sat over there and was blind and was begging. Some said, well, no, I don't think so. It looks like him, but that's not him. And the man answered and said, I am he. And they said, well, how were your eyes open? He said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. I went and washed. I received sight. And they said to him, well, where is he? And he says, I don't know. In fact, Jesus could have been standing right there. He wouldn't have known, because he'd never seen him. He actually went and washed and saw at the pool of Siloam, and he had never, ever seen Jesus. Well, they took him to the Pharisees. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. He said, he put clay upon my eyes, I washed, and I can see. And the Pharisees said, this man is not of God because he keeps not the Sabbath day. That was by their interpretation. Others said, how can a man that's a sinner do miracles like this? A big division among them. They said to the blind man again, What do you say of him that has opened your eyes? He said, he's a prophet. But the Jews didn't believe concerning him that he was blind and received his sight. They thought this is all fake. So they called in the parents and they said, is this your son whom you say was born blind? How come he sees now? His parents answered and said, we know that this is our son. We know that he was born blind. By what means he now sees? We don't know. Who has opened his eyes? We don't know. He is of age. Ask him. He shall speak for himself. Why did they respond that way? Because they feared the Jews. They knew that the Jews had agreed already that if any man confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. So they were just ducking and running. Therefore, his parents said, ask him. So they called the man in and says, give God the praise. We know this man is a sinner. And I like this guy. I really do like this guy because he is he's intelligent, he thinks, and he's brave. He answered and said, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind, now I see. And they said to him again, what did he do? How did he open your eyes? And he says, I told you already. You want to hear it again? You want to be his disciples? I think he's really starting to get a little irritated with them and really beginning to puncture their ego a little bit. They reviled him and said, you are his disciple. We're Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke for this Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he comes from. And the man answered, and he said, now this is a marvelous thing. You don't know where he came from, and he opened my eyes. To him, that was a pretty significant thing to say. You don't know where he came from, and yet he is the one that opened my eyes. Actually, it made a very profound statement about the Pharisees themselves. Now we know that God hears not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and does his will, him God hears. Since the world began, it was not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you were altogether born in sins, and you're going to teach us? And they cast him out of the synagogue. What are you going to do? What are you going to say to people who are like this? Well, Jesus heard he cast him out. That was a serious matter. And he went and found him, and he said, do you believe on the Son of God? And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And kid, you just stop and think, he had never seen him. He didn't understand. He had no faith in Jesus. I mean, he's just there. He says, who is he that I might believe on him? And Jesus said, you have seen him. It's he that talks with you. He said, Lord, I believe. And he did obeisance to him. And Jesus said, for judgment I am come into this world, that they who see might not see, and they who see, who see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which had heard these words said to him, are we blind also? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. You would almost think, they said, well, are we blind also? And Jesus would have said, well, yeah, you really are. But he said, no, you're not. If you were, you would be blameless. But you're not. In all these special Sabbath healings, Jesus did two very important things. He dismissed the fence that the Pharisees had built around the law as not only unnecessary and useless, but it was worse than that. It was positively harmful in the fact that there was good that could have been done that was not done because of their rules. The second, he established the day as a day to honor God. Now, it's in the Old Testament. It should have been clear to everybody, but it had gotten lost somewhere along the way. That the Sabbath is a day to honor God, not only in our rest, but in doing good. And not just in doing any good, but in doing God's good. The work of God on the Sabbath day honors him. Doing our own work does not.